Welcome, and thank you for joining today's hashtag Leading the Way Masterclass titled Boost Your Leadership Credibility, Managing How Others See You. Today's featured speaker, Janet Aioli, will share practical tips to help industry professionals project a credible leadership presence. Janet is a strategic partner and coach to executive leaders and a leadership presence expert. She specializes in women's leadership and empowerment and is a sought-after facilitator and speaker for women's leadership programs. Without further ado, please welcome Janet.
Before we get started today on this topic, I wanted to share with you a scenario that happens so often in my work with leaders that I think will set the stage for what we're going to be talking about today. And it'll also set the stage for a great conversation that we're going to have on this topic. I was working with a woman probably a few years ago, but it really doesn't matter who this is because this story happens over and over and over again. I can't tell you how many times I've seen almost the same exact scenario with different leaders. But just to focus on one person, I'll call this person Erica, which is not a real name. And I was working with her. She had just moved into a role that was a senior director role, pretty large responsibility. She had about 200 people reporting to her. In her purview. And it was quite a stretch assignment for her because she had moved from a leadership role that, she had probably 10, 15 people that she was responsible for to having now 200 and a large scope. And one of the things that she did probably about 6 months into the role is she went through a 360 feedback assessment. And for those of you that are not familiar with 360 feedback assessments, it's when you get feedback anonymously from your peers, your direct reports, and your boss, and you get a report that and it's really feedback on your leadership effectiveness. So that's what the feedback is focused on. And as I sat with her as we looked through the feedback, I can't tell you her reaction. She was stunned looking at the feedback. And not only stunned, but she was rattled and she was shaken. And so here are some of the comments, verbatim. I actually have kept a record of these, right, that were on this feedback report. Erica needs to build credibility. Erica is incredibly smart and talented, but she behaves like she needs to be the smartest person in the room. Erica seems uncomfortable in her new role and micromanages everyone. Erica seems overwhelmed, stressed, and overworked 90% of the time. And it is really hard to approach her or to get time with her. Everything seems to be a 5-alarm fire with Erica. Her urgency about everything just causes us all stress. Finally, 2 more. Erica is smarter than most people I know. And she definitely lets you know how smart she is. Erica seems uncomfortable in her new role. So imagine high-achieving woman who has been, moving up the ranks, who has been in leadership roles before, with a new team, trying to establish credibility in this senior director role, getting a feedback report like that. So imagine the reaction and the emotional reaction, thinking, wow, this is not my intention. How is this possible? How are people coming up with this perception of me when this is not at all how I intend? So as someone who works with, high achieving folks and leaders over the years, I will tell you this feedback is not unusual. right? And I see it over and over again as people move into different roles, right? Or different leadership positions with higher levels of responsibility and are trying to establish their credibility. But what is credibility? What are we talking about when we're talking about leadership credibility? And please feel free, write in the chat, what do you think of when you're thinking about, because she's getting these squishy comments, right? Well, she needs to build credibility. What is that? Like, what does that mean? Like, what do you think of when you think about leadership credibility? What do you think they're pointing to in that comment? You need to build credibility. I mean, have you ever heard that, or have you ever gotten any feedback like that? So feel free to type it in the chat any thoughts you have on what you think is credibility as we talk, because what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of peel back the notion of this squishy concept of leadership credibility and talk a little bit more in depth about it. Now, this has been fascinating me as someone who works in this space, right, in the executive coaching space. And one of the things I've done, over the years is I've tried to keep up themes of, what are the themes that keep coming up over and over again with people who are moving into leadership roles, higher and higher level leadership roles, that seem to be the themes that are influencing their credibility. And that, with a lot of research on the whole topic, has given me a little bit of insight on this whole notion of, what is this notion of leadership credibility? So if we move to the next slide, when you talk about credibility, what we're really talking about is the ability to, and if you look at the definition, right, what is credibility? It's the ability to inspire belief and trust, right? So that you're believable, in the role. And I always say, at least with the people I'm working with, we start to think about, well, you're believable when you're honest, or when you have integrity, or when you're consistent. Well, that's table stakes. So I'm assuming that the people that I'm working with are believable in terms of being honest, and that they have integrity. Because I haven't worked with anybody so far that isn't honest and doesn't have integrity. So it's not just that credibility. There's another component that shapes how people are seeing us as we move into these roles. And one thing I know for sure, I absolutely know for sure, is that what we intend is not always what people see. People only see what we say and what we do. And they can't read our minds. They have no idea what's in our head. So they don't know our intention. And what they do is they make up stories about what those things mean. And what I find is that sometimes those stories are true, but sometimes they're totally out of alignment with what we intend. And so when I'm talking about these elements of credibility today, which I'll tell you what I'll be talking about, I'll be doing 3 things today, is to help you really think about how close is the story to what you intend. And if it's not what you intend, how do you manage that story so that it's in closer alignment to what you want people to perceive you as? So I'm sure, when Erica looks at Erica needs to build credibility, or Erica thinks she's the smartest person in the room, I will guarantee you, after talking to her, that is not her intention. But that's the story that gets created based on a few elements that influence how others see us and also influence our credibility. So what are we going to be talking about today? So then on the next slide, we're going to be discussing the 5 elements that make up credibility, right? So I'm going to talk about, what are the 5 components that combine, because they combine. It's not one thing, right? They kind of combine. It's like the squishy thing. They combine to have people determine, is this person credible in their leadership role? And we're talking about leadership credibility, right? Then I'm going to provide you some practical tips for each one on, what are some things you can do, or we can all do, to boost our credibility in that area. And then at the end, because we can talk about this all day, and this is not a keynote speech, right? This is an action-oriented mini workshop. I'd like you to pick one thing that you're going to be doing differently just after having this conversation today that you can do right away to boost your own credibility. So that's our agenda for today, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So with that, let's talk about, what are the 5 elements? And, and we'll make this slide a little bit bigger so that you can see, what I'm really talking about when I look at the themes of what are the things that we're talking about that influence credibility. Okay. One of the things that we focus on the most, right, and we're always focused on, is thinking that it's competence. If I'm competent at what I'm doing, if I have the ability and the skills and I know everything, I'm credible. Well, that's partly true, right? Because we do look at competence, but what we know is that competence is only one element of the components that go into whether people see us as credible or not, right? So competence is important, but also I would like you to think about this. Think about, you're an accountant, right? And you have incredible competence in accounting. What's your competence as a leader? How much do you know about leadership? So here we're also talking about not just your knowledge in your field or your area, but your competence in leadership. And so that's an important shift for people to be able to see it's not just my competence in what I know about whatever my given topic is or my given field is, but it's my competence as a leader and my leadership skills. So, I'd like you to think about that a little bit. The other area that, is absolutely incredibly impactful on how people are judging credibility is the confidence, right? So Erica, for example, coming into the new role, was hesitant, also very reticent to talking to people. And it seemed as if she wasn't really owning the role or felt uncomfortable in the role. And one of the things about confidence is people will not believe the message if the messenger is not believable and the messenger doesn't believe in themselves or the message, right? So confidence is obviously a big component. Composure. How, some of the comments are talking about emotional intelligence, right? There's a lot about that, a lot of that, how composed we are, what our energy is like. There were comments in her 360 that talked about she's stressed and overwhelmed all the time. She's running around and doesn't seem to have time for us. That is influencing her credibility. Connection, how she connects with people, right? How you're connecting with people. How are you behaving? What's your empathy? Again, that emotional intelligence piece that you were talking about in the comments. Supports others in their role, right? That's important when you're building leadership credibility. And finally, and to me, I talk about this as the polish, but it's real, right? It is real whether we like it or not. Style also influences credibility. How you appear, right? How others see your body language, the way you carry yourself. All of those things influence the perception people have of how credible you are because it's part of the story they're getting about you. Any thoughts or anything else that you think about or you'd like to add to this? To this list here of the 5 elements, assuming like we're taking table stakes, honesty, integrity, and consistency, right? So to those, obviously those are elements, but I'm assuming that those are there already as we have this conversation. But is there anything else or anything that strikes you when you look at this? If it does, just please feel free to write it in the chat. But what we're going to do is we're going to peel these back a little bit, right? So let's peel them back and talk a little bit about, what are we talking about when we're talking about competence? Now, at least if you're like most of the people I work with, competence is a really important piece, and it's something that you focus on. And by the way, especially in the women's programs and with women I work with, I got to get another certification. I'm going to get another degree so that I can be seen as credible. I'm going to get more and more knowledge and skills and all of those things. People are looking at, do you have the skills and the knowledge and the experience to be able to be believable and trustworthy in what you're doing? Absolutely. However, I'd like you to reframe that for a minute and look at that competence when it comes to leadership. Because you can have all the knowledge in the world, but it's the leadership competence that we're talking about here. So that's what I'd like you to think about. So here are a couple tips to think about in terms of building your competence, right? So, and go to the next slide. Yeah. So the question for you is, are you managing or are you leading? Do you really understand the difference? And I know, that if there are people who say, oh yeah, that's kind of basic. Those are basic things. I've been a manager for a long time. I've been a leader for a long time. I see this at the most highest executive levels, that people are still managing and not using leadership competencies, right? So leading others, still needing to be the most smartest person in the room, right? Still needing to show how smart they are. And those were some of the comments that came up in Erica's 360. They come up over and over again. Do you have the leadership competence? Do you have enough self-awareness to be able to see, hey, I am not just the center of the universe here, but this is a team that I'm leading, and how do I highlight the smart people on my team? So the leadership competence is the skill here that we're building. So one of the things that I always tell people is, are you asking for feedback? Are you asking for genuine feedback on your leadership and acting on it? Are you learning more and more about leadership? Are you reading things only in your field? Or are you reading things about leadership? I don't care what your level is. I work with people at the highest levels. Taking a leadership class is not beneath you, even if you have been a leader for a long time. Refreshing yourself, learning about leadership and practicing being a leader is absolutely important in terms of your leadership competence. All right, so that's the competence piece, right? So that's the piece we focus on. But the piece that's going to really have a big impact on your overall credibility is this whole element of confidence. And that, if we go to the next slide. So talk to me a little bit about your feelings around this area of confidence. How confident do you feel you project? How much confidence do you feel like you project? And what I hear often is, I'm relatively confident. I'm confident about my abilities. Or it depends, right? It depends on who's in the room. It depends on whether I'm in a new role or not. It depends if I'm out of my comfort zone. It depends on a lot of factors. So what does your confidence depend on? And how many of you feel like you have that type of confidence that's grounded, that regardless of who's in the room, regardless of what I'm doing, I'm clear about what I contribute and what I'm bringing to the table? And as you're thinking about that, I'll bet that it's situational, right? That it kind of depends. So how do you start to build that confidence muscle, right? So that regardless of the situation, you're showing up with confidence and your body is relaxed You have an ease of expressing yourself in any situation. How do you do that? So if we go to the next slide, there's a great book called The Confidence Code. It's by Katie Kay and Claire Shipman. I don't know if any of you have read that book or seen that book, but Katie Kay and Claire Shipman, who are, they were actually news anchors on PBS, on BBC, I'm sorry, and have done a lot of research, actually quite a bit of research on confidence in women. And so if you haven't read that book, I would highly recommend it. But one of the things that we know for sure about confidence is that it's a head game. Everything about confidence starts in the head. It starts in our mind, right? And so it's funny, somebody right now is actually writing on here preparedness, right? I know that I have knowledge, so it does give me confidence. I'll fake it till I make it. Well, knowledge gives you a certain amount of confidence, right? But there will be times, especially as you move up the ladder and you get higher and higher levels of responsibility as a leader, there's no way you're going to know everything. You can't know everything. I work with people who have 8,000 people that work for them, right? They have an organization with divisions and all of these things going on in different areas. How are you going to know everything? You're not. So relying on your knowledge only to give you confidence or to be confident is kind of a double-edged sword, because there's a point where you've got to rely on the knowledge of others and be confident in your ability to rely on the knowledge of others. So that's kind of a really big shift. And it's a shift in mindset of being confident enough to not know things. And that's a huge transition that takes place. So just in terms of a few tips on confidence and building confidence, and we could do a whole workshop just on this, right? An interactive workshop on this. What are your thought habits? What are you telling yourself? Because I find that that's the biggest piece of confidence. Walking into a situation and being in your head. How do you get out of your head? So here's the one phrase that I tell all my clients to use, and I think it's huge, right? It's making the shift from, wow, what are they thinking about me? What am I going to do? What am I going to project here? To ask this question instead. What's needed here? And what that does is it shifts the focus off of you and onto service. And when you're shifted into service, your confidence goes up, because you're not in this self-centered, self-conscious mode, but you're in a mode of, how can I serve? What's the best thing to do here in this situation? And it takes the focus off of you. That's huge. The other thing about confidence, it's really funny, is recalling mastery experiences, right? So when you're in a situation where you're feeling a little less confident, you're walking into a situation, think about, well, wait a minute. When were the times where I did this and I knocked it out of the park? I've done this before. Recall those in your mind, because your mind has recorded those things. And the more you can bring those things into your mind and recall them, the more your confidence builds in your body. Right? Another one is create an alter ego. Somebody's saying fake it till you make it. I always hear about faking it till you make it, and I think that's a good one. But it's also, think about this one. Beyonce. How many of you know Beyonce? I mean, I would think most of you on the line have heard about who Beyonce is and know that who Beyonce is. Well, when she started out singing, she would get terrible stage fright and would get very uncomfortable in the performance, etc. So what she did is she created what she called an alter ego. And that was Sasha Fierce. If any of you have heard of that, she even has an album called Sasha Fierce. So she would say, when I get on stage, this is who I am. I am Sasha Fierce, and all the attributes of Sasha Fierce. So she started to embody this Alter ego. That Sasha Fierce was not afraid. Sasha Fierce was not worried about what she was going to say or do or how she was going to stand and all of those things. That's the alter ego. So what's your alter ego? That's another way to project or, fake it till you make it. But she wasn't really faking it because she was embodying the Sasha Fierce energy. By the way, Lady Gaga does the same thing. And, I've read about several athletes who do the same thing as well, who are embodying another persona of this is my persona that is fearless. And what happened with Beyonce? I don't know if you heard this, but at a certain point, she dropped the Sasha Fierce. And she said, I don't need that anymore. I'm Beyonce. So what had happened? It's that, I don't know if it was fake it till you make it, but she embodied that over time. The other thing about confidence is carry something with you. It's a talisman. This works, by the way. There's a lot of research on neuroscience research on this about carrying something to remind you. Some people carry like a little amulet or something to remind you to snap out of whatever it is you're thinking that's a negative self-doubt thought. Some people wear a rubber band around their wrist and they snap it. But whatever helps you build that confidence. Again, like I said, we could spend a day on talking about confidence and exercises on confidence, but it's a really important part of credibility. Okay, the next slide. Composure. Composure is a big one. So think about, I don't know how many of you are parents, right? So, or are around children, right? So you don't have to be a parent, but you're around children and a child falls, gets a huge cut on their leg. Blood is gushing everywhere. Child starts screaming, ah, right? What's your reaction? Ah, same reaction, right? What do you do in the moment? Do you go, ah? Probably not, right? What you do in the moment is remain calm. It's okay. It'll be fine. And you help the person regain their composure, right? And tend the wound. Well, as part of leadership credibility, you're the one in the role setting that tone. Because if the parent, right, ah, and the kid, ah, and everybody's, ah, what's happening, right? Chaos. Because the role of the parent is to maintain the calm in the situation. And it maintains, as one of my colleagues likes to say, maintains the weather, right? So composure, your composure, and how you come across is so obviously critical to how others will come across and how others will see you. So that these whole areas of emotional intelligence, regulating your own thoughts, your own energy, managing your discouragement, all of those things are critical in the role, because you're not just you're also the role and the composure in the role. So moving from reactive to compose is such a big part of leadership credibility. And so one of the things they mentioned about Erica, as I mentioned earlier, was that she was running around with her hair on fire all the time. And that one of the comments was, everything's a 5-alarm fire. Well, if everything's a 5-alarm fire from the leader, think about this energy that's happening to the entire team, right? So what's happening? Everything is now being funneled down and everybody's in chaos. So the composure that you're showing is a critical part of establishing leadership credibility. Any thoughts or comments on that? Or have you ever worked with anybody who perhaps lacks this composure, and what is the impact it has on the team? How do you maintain your own composure? When you're not feeling it, right? Because we all have emotions. We're all reacting to our environment at different times. So how do you do that? What are some of the techniques you're using? Feel free to write them in the chat. This is a critical element of whether people are seeing us as credible or not. The ability to maintain our composure, manage our energy, manage our own setbacks, failures, anything that's happening to us. Because we're setting the tone, because we're not just us, we're the role as well. And I know you know this, so it's not, I'm not telling you anything new here, but what I am telling you are things that are common knowledge, perhaps, but not common practice. And I know that for sure because I work with so many people over and over again, the same situations. We're all dealing, if you have this all figured out and you have all of these components of credibility figured out, then more power to you. But I think we're all struggling and we're all on the same journey of trying to self-manage and self-monitor ourselves. And it's funny, some of the comments, that's so true. Sometimes you just have to stop and breathe. And I think that's so true. I mean, that is actually one of the huge techniques that you can use to maintain composure. There is science behind stop and breathe, because what it does is the breathing, right? We have two parts of our nervous system, right? The sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And when one of them gets activated and we get into this fight or flight mode, taking deep breaths relaxes the nervous system so that the other part of our nervous system can kick in. So absolutely, right on in terms of breathing. It's not just a cliche when somebody says relax and breathe. There's something to that breathing. Okay, so tips to build composure, right? So what other than breathing, right? One of the things, obviously, this is basic emotional intelligence. When you're starting to feel some sort of an emotion that's getting away from you in the moment, name it, right? So name that emotion. Wow, I'm feeling frustrated, or I'm feeling really angry here, or whatever it is, to yourself, right? So you don't name it out loud, but become aware of that. So the power of the pause in that moment. Wow, what's that about? So being curious about your own emotion and just taking that pause. I know for some of us, the emotion is so strong, we may need to just, put something away and do something else for a bit. But learning to manage and self-regulate that emotion, and obviously there are classes on emotional intelligence, right? And books written about it. But that is such a huge piece of maintaining our composure. And some of you mentioned emotional intelligence in here. And this is such a short session that we're obviously not talking about this. This is just quick highlights of some of these things. But also, instead of personalizing, I think composure has a lot to do with personalization. We personalize things and we get defensive. And defensive, to me, is the enemy of leadership effectiveness. It's the enemy of personal effectiveness. It's the enemy of effectiveness, period, is when we personalize things. So that question I asked you earlier, I would use it here as well, is instead of personalizing something, what's needed here? What's needed here? Takes the focus off of you, puts you in a place of composure. What's needed here? And also the ability, the commonality is to expect setbacks and failures and believe, okay, I recover from these quickly. Okay. And finally, we have two more of these left: connection. So the next element that people look at when they're looking at us in terms of credibility as a leader is, how are we connecting with others? Right. So, again, these emotional intelligence pieces, I know some of you have been writing about that in the chat. Empathy. What's my degree of warmth? How do I respect? Do I respect and value others? Do I display that? Do I show curiosity and interest, or am I too consumed with myself? Right. So, quick story on this one. I was working with someone who actually it was a puzzling scenario for him because he got some feedback that he didn't like people and that he was aloof and that he was unapproachable. And what was so fascinating is that his whole career was built around the way he valued building teams and people. So this was like a disconnect for him. He's like, well, I don't know why people would think I'm unapproachable and I'm aloof when that's me. Like I am like so much the opposite of that. I'm such a people person. I enjoy being around people, all of that. And so what we found, as we dug a little bit about, what's with that, right? What's with that is that in his new role, he had been elevated to a senior vice president. He was sitting in a area, and then, this is obviously before all our remote work. And he was sitting in an area where his office was in the corner, and there was a row of desks outside of his office. And he would be going back and forth, right? So there are all these people new people that work for him that were in these cubicle type places and then also in offices with windows. So they could see him going back and forth. And he was constantly going back and forth to meeting after meeting, running around frenzied. And as he was doing that, he was running into his office and he was running out of his office. And he had his head down and he was looking at his phone, looking at what's my next meeting. And people were looking at him, right? And he was obviously not acknowledging them or talking to them because he was focused on his next meeting. And so thus, aloof, unapproachable, doesn't like people. Shocker, right? Quick fix, right? Because what he did is he said, okay, hey, I'm going to give myself a little time. I'm going to spend time connecting. I'm going to say hello to people. It was just such a very, very, very quick fix. But it shows you the power of perception, because the story that people were creating about him was totally opposite of what the real story was, right? The real story was, I love people. I'm just running around crazy with my head on fire and go back to composure, right? And, I was not intentionally not connecting with people. So I tell that story because I think it's a great one of the awareness factor of not realizing sometimes how we're interacting or connecting with others and thinking, yes, I am connecting, but yet I never have time for you, but yet I never X. So that's a huge component of how others perceive your credibility. So with that, for the next slide, some of the, just a real few quick tips on this one. How to build this connection, right? And this is a whole other area, right? This is, to me, the crux of leadership, period. But if we were to just talk about a few things that can help build the credibility when it comes to connection, the biggest mindset shift, I think, that has the biggest impact is approaching others with curiosity instead of judgment to build connection. Because when we're curious and we ask questions, there's a different dynamic than when we're sitting back and placing judgment. Oh, that person is this. Oh, that person is that. Or somebody says something and immediately we jump to a judgment. So this is huge. Curiosity and ask questions instead of judge. Also, just, going back to my example of this, of Eric, as I'll call him, just walking by and displaying interest to people, acknowledging people. That's such an obvious one. But the other thing is also giving your full attention. I'll ask you this: how often in this age of multitasking, and especially now with remote, all our remote work that we're doing, do you give your full attention to someone? Do you make eye contact, look them in the eye, and be fully present? That, if there was one element that is the most important in terms of connection, is putting away the phone, right? So if you're sitting in your office, so let's go into the office, and you're sitting in your office and I'm talking to you and you're looking down like this. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Obvious, right? So we all know this. How many times has that been done to you? And how many times do you do that? Just a question. That's connection. That's connection. And then finally, do what you say you will do. And that goes back to credibility. It goes back to keeping my word. It goes back to respect, honesty. I respect you. I respect your time, etc. Okay, and then finally, we go to elements of style, right? So style is the funky one because style, whether I always say, it's the foundations, and there's depth first and then polish. But the reality is people do look at polish. They do look at style. It's the first thing. I mean, we're visual creatures as human beings. So we do look to see how believable you are just based on your appearance, your voice, your manner of engaging, and are you believable? So let me give you an example of this. So you're a rock star, right? That's appropriate. There's a certain dress that's pretty appropriate if you're a rock star. So you wouldn't expect a rock star to show up at a rock concert with a three-piece suit on, in a tie, and stand like this. You probably wouldn't. You wouldn't be expecting that. Now, you wouldn't expect somebody dressed as if they would be a rock star, right? With whatever it is that a rock star wears, right? Going into a boardroom and giving a presentation. So regardless of what we think, and I'm one who's really big on individuality and all of those things, but I also think, we have a choice in terms of being intentional about the impression we make and the appropriateness of whatever that is in that. Because the reality is, and people can overcome this over time, but the reality is when we're making an initial quick impression, these things matter. So even voice tone, right? So, hi, I'm Janet. How are y'all doing today? May work in certain settings, and that energy level may or may not work in another setting. So being cognizant and mindful of how that's going to impact the appearance of my credibility, and it puts it back into my place of choice to be able to monitor that. Okay, I know, there's a lot here. I threw a lot of bullets at you very, very, very quickly, but I was mindful of time. But I'd like you to do a self-assessment of your own just for a minute, right? And think about, just these 5 elements we talked about quickly, just your own leadership credibility. And assuming, yeah, Janet, some of these things are basic. They're basic leadership things. They're basic things that I know about leadership. I know about myself. But if you looked at these things and you did a self-assessment and look at the questions on this assessment here, what are the 1 or 2 things that you can tweak or change that would have an impact on the perception of your own credibility? Even if you think you are credible and are credible as a leader, what are the 1 or 2 things that you can tweak and you can change and be more aware of? So I'd love you to share that with us in the chat if you come up with 1 or 2 things or 1 thing that you feel like, if I just tweak this a little bit, I would be seen as more credible. Dress the part. Okay? Yeah, that's the outside, right? The style piece. Because I'm intentional about the impression I make. What about in composure or confidence? Or even your own leadership competence? Is there anything that you could be doing differently or that you want to tweak? that you're aware of. Some of these things that I mentioned to you today, we're talking about folks at some of the highest levels weren't aware of. Connection across teams. Yeah. Listening more. Yeah. Composure and confidence. And what specifically, right? So what specifically would you be doing? What's the one specific thing that you can do to boost that? So that's what I would be asking you to think about. And I think sometimes we think this is for other people, right? Or, I don't need to work on that. And I would also encourage you to get some feedback from people that you trust, that will give you honest feedback about, how am I coming across in these areas? Composure, wait for others to complete their thoughts and don't interrupt them, even if I disagree with everything they're saying. Absolutely, right? And this is a good one, because what we do is we wait for someone to complete their thoughts so that we can and say, oh, okay, I don't want to interrupt you, but we're still thinking about the next thing that we're going to say, and we jump in. How often do we do that? Or is that done to you? So I'm not really listening to you, right? What I'm doing is I'm waiting for you to finish. So I'm being polite, but I'm not really connecting with you because I'm really more focused on me and what I'm going to say next. Being mindful not to rush to get to the business at hand, but remember to connect and be personable. That's such a good one. That's so important, right? Taking the time. How often do you ask people, how are you doing today? Or at the beginning of a meeting, a best practice. What a couple leaders that had some of the highest engagement scores that I've ever seen. One of the things they did was at the beginning of every meeting, they did what they call a check-in. And the check-in, obviously don't have time, right? We still have tasks to get done, but they would take 10 minutes out of every staff meeting at the beginning. And there was time, they said 10 minutes. And they'd say, I want to go around, we're going to talk about things that aren't work and find out what's going on in your world and share it. 10 minutes. And so they knew, it was brief and quick, but deep. And over time, that started to develop a connection with people, because then you can call on, hey, my brother just got married. You bring that up. Oh, so how was the wedding? And it really just started to build a connection among the team. And it's really simple. I know that sounds so simplistic, but how often do people do that? So I love that. Confidence in the face of criticism. I love that. I love that one, right? Because there you go with the personalizing again. We take things personally. Absolutely. Do we have to change our style to get to the next level? That's a great question. And what does that mean? Here's how I look at style, because I'm not one big on, I do workshops on power presence, and I'm not big on the outside, right? Because I think we spend so much focus on the outside image rather than working on the inside. Because to me, polishing a rock that's empty and that's hollow is irrelevant. But do you really have to change your style? And I would ask you, what do you all think? What do you think? Do you have to change your style? Because the style is what makes you unique. What do you think? Anybody want to take a stab on their thoughts on that? Do you have to change your style? Different styles are important and should be accepted. Absolutely, right? And so I think sometimes we assume that there's a pigeonhole, or there's a way of being or a way of looking that has to be, I have to be this certain way, or I have to act this certain way. And that's not what I'm talking about here at all. What I'm talking about is being aware of how you're coming across in the moment, right? And being aware of embracing your own style, right? But also being cognizant of the impact you're having. And I think those two things are opposite sides of the same exact coin. So let me give you an example. For years, earlier on in my career, I was working with executives at the highest levels, starting at age 25, right? And so I would walk in, and I always had this, I guess it was my own insecurity, but I would assume that that's what people were thinking, right? Is that, oh, wow, this 25-year-old girl is going to tell us about leadership when I'm talking to a group of people who are at least twice my age in the room, who have a lot of experience, et cetera. So I was really, really, it was my own thing about that. So, I cut my hair, at a certain level. I had it in this really straight bob, and I always wore these more conservative suits so that I looked older. And what I realized is, while that worked, I don't think that was what people were focused on. They were focused on what Janet brings to the table as soon as Janet opened her mouth after a few minutes, right? And so I was overly focused on that. And so what I did is I said, hey, I'm going to let my hair grow out. This is my style. I grew up in Europe. I have a little bit more of a flair the way I dress. And, not inappropriate, right? I didn't come in dressed like a rock star to a board meeting, but I let my own personal style go through. And it actually made me feel more authentic, but it had no impact. Actually, it had an impact because that was part of my style. So it's about finding your own style and your own voice, not being so hung up on some of these things, but really letting that depth and that substance shine through. So that's my thought on the style piece. I absolutely think that, what makes us unique and different is having a different style. Yeah, I'm tattooed and pierced and dressed uniquely, and my team sees me as a human. Absolutely. And I think, that's something, that's a whole other piece of learning, as the leader, what are you modeling in terms of perception as well, right? Because what you're modeling is what other people will create as the norms. So what norms are you creating? So I'm with you on that. It's really, what are the norms that you're creating on your team around what's credible? And that's huge. And that's it. Polish your style, make it clean, thoughtful, but it's yours. Absolutely. That's exactly it. So what we're talking about is that you are intentional. And that's what I like to portray in this is, are you intentional? Have you given it thought? Are you thoughtful about your style as well? Authenticity and coming across in a way that allows to connect with who is in front of us is important. Absolutely. And I will, let me say something on authenticity, because this one's a big one. And it comes, that's something I've always valued. I always will value being authentic. But what is authentic? And I think we get that confused a little bit. Authentic, some of us will think about authentic as being able to say whatever I want at any time, regardless, right? I'm being authentic. I'm saying whatever's coming to my mind. Well, if you look at the word authentic, what it really means is it means from original source. Original source. Think about that for a second. How much of your behavior and your actions are from original source? Think about all the layers that have shaped who you are, your culture, what you've been taught, the environments you've been in. Keep going, right? All the things that create, quote, your authentic self. So there are all these layers that aren't really yours or from original source. So when I'm talking about authentic, I'm talking about original source to original source without all those layers. Not necessarily what I've been taught, what I believe, all of these layers that are above us. So to me, we have the opportunity to create what our authentic self is, not just say, well, I'm just being authentic because that came to my mind. And to me, what authenticity is about is choosing my response. There's a great book. If any of you, I don't know if any of you have read this book. It's called Man's Search for Meaning, and it's by Viktor Frankl. Really incredible book. And Viktor Frankl was a psychologist who was in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany. And obviously he witnessed atrocities in that camp that, no one would ever want to witness again in their lifetimes, right? Or in any lifetime. And his whole family was imprisoned. And what he observed as a psychologist as he was taking notes was how some people responded to the environment they were in. And some people would completely break down. They would have a mental breakdown. They died because they couldn't take the conditions, etc. And he said, as in his book, he talks about that experience and what he learned. And to me, this is the crux of what I talk about when I talk about leadership, when I talk about self-management, when I talk about presence. He says, in between this stimulus, which is what happens to us, and our response, so when we respond, there's a space there. That space, in that space, is our ability to choose our response. Right? So we choose the response. In that choice is where our growth and our freedom lie. And to me, that's really what we're talking about, is pausing and choosing. And that's what credibility is. That's what presence is the ability to pause and choose, because every single moment, what we say, what we do, and how we make people feel are who we become. So to me, that's what we're talking about. If I was to boil it all up with all these nice fancy slides, right? That's what we're talking about. Pausing and choosing. So you're in the place of choice about your style. You're in the place of choice about your confidence. You are in the place of choice. And that's what I think we're talking about when we talk about credibility. What are you choosing? And are you pausing? So with that, I know we're running out of time. I think we have 2 minutes left. Are there any other comments or questions that we want to address in the next 2 minutes? Or Michelle, is there anything else that we need to do before we end? Just being cognizant of your time. Oh, and so, okay, go ahead. There was a really quick question of 1 minute about, okay, so all of these elements are great, but we're virtual, right? So being intentional virtually is just as important. So think about, I do, one of the things I had to learn as a coach when I took coach training is how to operate virtually, right? I was talking to my clients on the phone and I was thinking, how can you connect on the phone? Especially now we at least have the Zoom and we have Teams technologies, WebEx, and so we can see each other. But how do you connect? Same way, right? Being fully present. And if I was to give you one tip, one thing, be here now. Be here now. Be fully present, have your camera on when you're talking to people. Look at people as if they were there. So I know we're out of time, so we won't be able to go into that one even further. But thank you so much for having me today. And it was a pleasure talking with all of you on this topic. This was a so important topic.